I'll watch it sometime. By the way, I invited my niece and my brother.
Okay, great. Love to have them join us.
Yeah, I doubt it.
Okay.
But we're hoping.
All right, we should be recording now. The link to the source sheet is in the chat. Let me just open up the file, and we can get started. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Next week, Wednesday evening, is our Yom HaZikaron, Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration. I didn't know if there's appetite for the Parsha Shir also.
Sure.
We have, again, everyone, I want people to come to everything, but we have Motzei Shabbos is the Melava Malka from Indy Dickler. Sunday night is the book discussion. Wednesday is the Yom Ha'atzmaut. So is that too much Zoom for everyone, or should we plan on the Parsha Shir also?
Okay with me.
I have a conflict on Tuesday, but
Okay.
don't judge it on that.
Okay.
I usually come for the share, but I'm not going to be heartbroken if we decide not to do it next week. Just let me know.
Okay. Well, great to have you with us tonight, Karen.
Thank you. Sorry, yeah, my camera's off. I just got home from work. I need to eat dinner.
Okay. Enjoy.
Thank you.
All right. So it sounds like maybe we will be on for next Tuesday night also. Great. So we're in Parshat Shemini this week, and let me get the source sheet up. The week of Pesach, I have to remind myself how to do all this stuff again. All right, can everyone see it?
No, there it is.
Yeah, I can see it now.
Okay, I will zoom in. All right, so Parshat Shemini really is divided into two parts. The first part talks about what happens on the 8th day, which is the day of the dedication of the Mishkan, which was began as quite a joyous, happy occasion and was marred by tragedy with the death of Nadav and Avihu. And so most years I've spoken about that part of the Parsha. And then we have a rather abrupt break, and the Torah transitions to talk about what makes for kosher animals. So we're going to focus on the kosher animals part of the Parsha, the second half of the Parsha in tonight's class. I have to say, as I was putting stuff together, I came across a source sheet prepared by Rabbi David Polsky, who was a very good friend of mine. We were in yeshiva in Israel together, stayed in touch for many years. We've fallen out of touch a little bit more recently, but it was great to see his name pop up, and I'm indebted to him for having begun to compile some of the sources that we're going to look at tonight. So just to get us into it, you don't need to. This is going to be more of an idea parsha shir than a textual based shir, but we have the at least introductory verses before the Torah goes into the long list of the different animals and specifically birds that it gives us by species or by names that are kosher, that are not kosher. So we know that the defining characteristics, of course, among animals are what?
No.
I know someone knows. Everyone's muted, though. So for the animals, it's a split hoof and chews its cud. And for fish, it talks about fish also. What's the characteristics of fish?
Fins and scales.
Fins and scales. Very good. And what about birds?
Tradition.
Tradition. Right, birds, we don't have a telltale sign. There are those who want to claim that at least one essential characteristic is that it cannot be a bird of prey. Right. This is not really true, as many birds that are kosher do hunt. The best example of that I've seen is ducks. Ducks will eat fish out of the water, right? So some want to claim, well, maybe if it's in the water, it's not really considered like a real animal, so it's not really predatory, but they eat fish. They definitely hunt. right? We have records of, yeah, maybe not in their natural state, but certainly chickens and the mass farms that they live in or that they're raised on. Nowadays, we certainly have examples of chickens eating their own, eating other animals on the farm. So that's not a true characteristic. So there's not a real sign when it comes to birds other than the Masorah, other than the tradition, and a really interesting topic on that, which we're not going to get into tonight, but maybe for different years, the question of turkey. And is turkey, should turkey be considered kosher? The short of it is that it's not a bird that's mentioned in the Torah or any of the older texts that we have listing the birds that are kosher, and so therefore there is no established tradition. Those who say that turkey is kosher, which I'm going to venture to say is everyone on this call, well, maybe not. Those who say it is kosher make the argument, well, it clearly is part of the same family and species of birds that we do eat, and had it been known, had it not been, to the rabbis of old, it would have been included in all the lists that we have, but it wasn't known, so therefore it couldn't have been included. So it's a really interesting topic about how and why we're able to eat turkey. There are those who don't. Many of us know Jake and Emma Exler, their son-in-law Eli Confer does not eat, his family has the tradition not to eat turkey. They're descendants of the Tosfos Yom Tov, Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman, who was a really prominent 19th century rabbi, and he did not think turkey was kosher. And so there are Jews nowadays who do not eat turkey for that reason. Interesting similar discussions about various species of duck and other birds that are relatively new to the Western consciousness, I guess we could say. But again, that's not for tonight. It's just a way of introduction. What I want to do tonight is look at some various theories offered as to what these laws of Kashrut are all about, which is an interesting gateway into the broader question of Ta'amei HaMitzvot, right? Is it legitimate to try to seek explanations and rationale for the mitzvot, for the commandments that God has given us? This is a major debate among Jewish philosophers, right? Some say, of course, we have to try to understand, and there must be a logic and there must be a rationale to it, or at least for the majority of mitzvot, right? We tend to categorize mitzvot as chukim and mishpatim, chukim being those mitzvot that we can't rationally explain. And the best example of that is the para aduma, the red heifer, although many other examples of chukim, or potentially. And mishpatim are mitzvot that make good sense, right? Do not murder, honor your parents. Those, no one needs any deep explanation as to why that was given to us as a mitzvah. It makes perfect sense. The only question is if we're supposed to teach our children and ourselves to do it for the reason of it, right? Do we not murder because it's cruel and we don't want anyone to murder us or our friends and family? Or do we have to do it only because it's a mitzvah, right? Do we teach our kids, love your, like, be kind to your fellow, your peer, to your friends, because it's a mitzvah and that's why we're supposed to do it, or because it's the right thing to do? So that's another hot topic of debate among those who talk about the philosophy of halacha. So among that is the question of, can we really offer explanations and understand why the mitzvot exist? So as we'll see, this comes up in various attempts to make sense of the laws of Kashrut. Any questions or thoughts to what we've, this sort of long introduction?
Anything that can help us keep a mitzvah is good.
Okay, so maybe the explanation is sort of more practical, not that we can, right? Part of the reason that we can't really understand the mitzvot is because we're simple humans, and the mitzvot were given by God and His infinite wisdom. But maybe it's a nice incentive, or if it helps us to do what we're supposed to do, so it's a worthwhile reason, right? The danger with that, and is what if we have the explanation wrong, right? What if we think we're doing it for a good reason, but that's not the truly intended reason why the mitzvah is there? So question, again, very big, broad question, do mitzvah require kavanah? Do they require proper intention? And if we say that they do, and we have the intention wrong, so what does that mean? So all sorts of fun mind, I don't want to say mind games, but fun mental gymnastics that we can play as these philosophical questions come up. And just worth to keep in mind that these are debates that have not been resolved. So there's still ongoing, still various camps within the Jewish community that are comfortable offering explanations, are not comfortable offering explanations, and that all plays out into this. So with that, let's jump into our first approach, which we'll call the rational approach, the Rambam approach, the medical approach. The Rambam tells us in the Moreh Nevuchim, right? Interestingly, at the Rambam, he only has two major works: the Guide for the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, and the Mishnah Torah. In the Moreh Nevuchim, he dives into philosophical understandings and explanations for the mitzvot that he doesn't get into in the Mishnah Torah in his halachic work. And why that's the case is another topic of great, much discussion among scholars of Maimonides. But in the Guide for the Perplexed, he says as follows. Let's make sure everyone can see what he says. I maintain that the food which is forbidden by the law, by the Torah, is unwholesome. There is nothing among the forbidden kinds of food whose injurious character is doubted. Meaning everyone agrees that the food that the animals, the food that's prohibited by the Torah, everyone knows that it's harmful, that it's dangerous. The only thing that people raise questions about is pork, right? And the Torah itself tells us that pork or pig is kind of needs to be in its own category. And right, the Gemara points out that it's kind of sneaky because it has one of the simanim, one of the signs of a kosher animal, but not the other. It has a split hoof, but it doesn't chew its cud. So it's sneaky in that way. And so there is some doubt about pork, but he says even pork, the doubt is not justified. Pork contains more moisture than necessary for human food. Again, this is Rambam science from the 10th, 11th century. This is not what our scientific understanding of nutrition and animals tells us, but this is what the Rambam was assuming, that there is harm in pork because of the moisture content or whatever else, too much superfluous matter. The principal reason why the law forbids swine's flesh is to be found in the circumstance that its habits and its food are very dirty and loathsome. It's already been pointed out how emphatically the law enjoins the removal of the sight of loathsome objects, even in the field and in the camp. How much more objectionable is such a sight in towns? But if we were allowed to eat swine's flesh, the streets and houses would be more dirty than any cesspool, as may be seen in the present country of the Franks. Okay, so we don't eat pork, and if you want an explanation or you want proof why we shouldn't, just go look at the Franks, look at the Germans, and how and how disgusting a place it is because it leads to dirtiness and loathsomeness. Okay, so he says that it's somehow dirty, it's somehow unwholesome, and therefore we can't eat it. The Sefer Chinuch, who follows the Rambam by and large, says similarly. Al kain hirchiktanu toratenu hashleima mikol davar hagorem bo hefsei. The Torah has removed from us anything that causes damage or defect. Al derech hazel if you have shots ne'emar shebalanu ha'isur b'torah b'chol machalot asurot. And this explains all the forbidden foods in the Torah. Im yesh mehen she'ein noda lanu v'lo lechachmei harefuah nizakan. If there is some food that's forbidden by the Torah that we don't know what damage or how it's harmful, al titma aleihem. Don't be surprised. Because the true doctor who warned us against eating it is much smarter than any of the doctors that we have accessible to us. Meaning God is much smarter. And if God said it's forbidden, it must be that it's going to cause some harm, even if we're not aware of the harm that it causes. Ella b'ma shehisighu, right? How foolish is it to think that something is only harmful if you know for sure what the harm is that it poses. Right, but the reason wasn't revealed to us, but it's clear that there must be some harm or some detrimental effect associated with the foods that the Torah forbids us. Okay, so very much along the lines of the Rambam, that there must be a rational explanation. And finally, one more source, we could find many Rishonim who follow this line of thinking. The Rashbam tells us all the domesticated beasts, free-roaming beasts, birds and fish, and certain types of locusts and other creeping creatures that God has outlawed for consumption by Jews is due to the fact that they cause excessive heat in our bodies when eaten, affecting our health detrimentally, and therefore they are called impure. Okay, so the first line of thinking says that there is some physical harm, something unhealthy associated with the foods that the Torah forbids us. Any reactions to this line of thinking? Any thoughts, questions?
There's always the chance that on every age will someone decide our science does better.
Right. That's for sure. So the counter argument to that would be, well, there must be some eternal truth that rings true across the ages, and if our science tells us differently, then it's our science that's mistaken. That's one variation. The Rambam says famously that we give precedence to science, and we have to go according to the best science of our understanding, so that if there is a contradiction between Torah logic or halachic logic and scientific logic, scientific knowledge, we should follow what the doctors say. It doesn't mean to say if the doctors were to come out and tell us that pork is healthy and it will do wonders for you and add years to your life and cut down whatever pain or disease, that it's okay to eat pork. It doesn't mean that, but that the prohibition still remains in place. But the Rambam would give precedence to the scientific explanation and say that we have to find therefore a different explanation for the Torah's prohibition of these items.
Is there anything? I'm sorry. Is there anything in the rationalists' writings that talk about the mixture of meat and milk as being inherently unhealthy?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of explanations that get into that, into what might the harm be for meat and milk, right? But it certainly was seen as being not a healthy combination for different reasons. Either because meat and milk were seen as different realms that aren't supposed to mix, and that there's some harm that comes from that. The rationalist approach, we'll get a bit more into it a bit later, but also that there's the compassion that's taught by not, at least the original prohibition against cooking a kid in its mother's milk, which is the source, and then all other meat and milk is extended from that, so that there's also this element of compassion that's supposed to be derived from that prohibition.
Aren't we going to be allowed to eat pork in the days of Mashiach?
No, the Torah says it's clearly forbidden. Right? We have the famous Gemara that says anything that's forbidden to us, there's some counter thing that's permitted, and so there are kosher foods that many say taste like pork. Right? There's some vegetable. There's a vegetable also that people are using, right? And maybe the answer to that, the explanation of that Gemara is, now that we have all this artificially or genetically modified, artificially produced meat, or not real meat, maybe that's how we can enjoy pork. But no, the pork will not be permitted to us, even if our understanding of the science changes. Just might have to find a better explanation.
I don't mean now. I mean in the days of Mashiach. There's a tradition that pork will be allowed to us in the days of Mashiach.
Pork will be allowed to us in the days of Mashiach?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, maybe. Maybe.
And so the dispute is, well, what kind of changes need there be in the pig that we would be able to eat it? And from the description of the Rambam, which if anybody's ever been on a farm, pigs love to wallow in the mud. That's, there's no question about that. And almost any, no matter what. So maybe it'll just be that they'll be raised differently in a different environment. I don't know.
Right. People keep pigs as pets, and they're apparently very clean animals. They go in the mud because that cools them off.
Yeah, right.
So if they're in an air-conditioned house, they don't need the mud to cool them off.
Right. I don't know. But it is, there is speculation about this.
Yeah.
Like, we just studied it in Acharon Shel Pesach, and so that's how I happen to know it.
Okay, interesting. Right. Another big question on this whole approach is, well, what about all the kosher animals that give us, that our doctors wish we wouldn't be eating, right? All the brisket and whatever else we just ate over Yontif, right? It's not doing anyone's cholesterol any favors. It's not doing anyone's blood pressure any favors. There's plenty of kosher food that by our medical standards is not healthy. And, so one answer might be everything in moderation, but then so why not these forbidden foods in moderation? But that's another strong argument or strong question on this approach is that, as the Ramban writes, that it's very possible to be naval b'rshut Torah, to be it's normally translated as a naval, as an ingrate or a disgusting person, but completely following the Torah's laws. And certainly it's possible to be very unhealthy, to eat a very unhealthy kosher diet. And so that might be another argument against that approach of explaining the laws of kashrus. So the strongest objection by the classical sources is brought by the Akedat Yitzchak, or Yitzchak Arama, and I'll read this one in the English because it's just so strongly worded. We ought to bear in mind, he says, that the dietary laws are not, as some have asserted, motivated by therapeutic considerations. God forbid. Were that so, the Torah would be reduced to the level of a minor medical treatise. This is abhorrent. Moreover, the alleged ill effects can be treated with various drugs, just as there are antidotes to the most powerful poisons. In that event, the prohibition would no longer apply, and the Torah would be rendered void. In source number 7, the Abravanel says similarly, and he says, there's plenty of people that eat pork that seem to be pretty healthy and lead long lives, and doesn't seem to necessarily hold up with reality. And as the Akedat Yitzchak says, if that's the only reason, if that is the reason for the prohibition, then it would be making the Torah into kind of a trivial book, right? Well, how's it any different than the Farmer's Almanac or any other folk wisdom or wives' tales or other low grade medical guide. As Nechama Leibowitz writes, which I thought was a very powerful way to conclude this section. Evidently, God left it to man to discover the secrets of health and nutrition, to ameliorate his living conditions, and to benefit civilizations at large. All these are included in the command to Adam to fill the earth and subdue it. Since the Torah offered no guidance on the poisonous properties of mushrooms and herbs, but left this task to man, why should it single out the animals that are healthiest for man's digestions? Right, so she says, first of all, if it truly is, if the laws of kashrus are truly to protect us, then we should have been told explicitly not to eat mushrooms that are going to poison you and not to eat other things that are dangerous that are not mentioned and that in fact technically might be kosher. And secondly, given the strong objections raised, she says that it must be that we're supposed to figure out how to be healthy on our own, and the Torah is not providing us medical advice in its list of prohibited and permitted foods. So we're going to move on to the second approach unless there's any other comments or thoughts on this.
I guess if we got into vegans and vegetarianism and so on, we could be here a long time.
Yeah, well, we're going to touch on that. We're going to touch on that in a little bit, but yes, that does give rise. It does give rise to one of the big questions. That is a big question that is often discussed when it comes to kashrus. Actually, let's go there now. Let's skip ahead. Source number 10 for anyone who's printed it out. So the source, right, where we're allowed to eat meat is after the flood, after Noah emerges from the ark. And God says to Noah, God gives him the blessing to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. You'll have dominion over all the animals and all the birds and all the fish. Right? Everything that roams on earth is for you to eat, just like the grass and the foliage and the vegetables. But you may not eat flesh with its blood. You cannot eat blood, you cannot murder humans, but you can eat animals so long as you do not consume the blood as well. So many feel that this was a concession made to Noah after the flood, either as kind of a reward for having saved all of the animal kingdom. You now have added control and dominion over them that you were not originally given. Or some say it was kind of to allay Noah's fears. What if there's going to be another flood or another event of mass destruction and the vegetation will be destroyed again? So God says, don't worry, you can eat animals, you have another source of food available to you. But Moshe David Kasuto and others say, based on these psukim and others, right, the prohibition against eating blood. Apparently the Torah seeks to convey that in principle man should refrain from eating meat. The prohibition on blood implies respect for the principle of life. It serves also to remind us that rightly all parts of the flesh should have been forbidden. It behooves us, therefore, to eschew eating at least one element thereof in order to remember the earlier prohibition. Okay, that there was a limit placed on how we may consume meat, that we could add to that the fact that it has to be properly shechted. But there was a limit placed on how we may consume meat in order to remind us that really we're not supposed to be eating meat, that this was a concession made because of whatever base desires Noah had, or whatever concessions God made to Noah after the flood. But this is a b'di'evet, right? And so famously, there are those who say that when Mashiach, right, there's a whole debate, are we going to continue to consume meat when Mashiach comes? Are there going to be animal sacrifices in the third Beit HaMikdash, right? We're introducing and touching on major philosophical debates, but that's part of what plays into it, right? So those who say that ideally the Torah advocates for vegetarianism, that's how Adam Harishon ate, that's what God intended when he created humans, and then due to human weakness, human frailty, a concession was made that we can consume meat, but that there's some element of a reminder in the way that we eat meat that this is less than ideal.
Did Kasuta live 116 years?
No, I don't think he did. I think that's, I must have, I think
Very good, Gary.
maybe it's 1853. He did not live 116 years, so that's a good catch. Sorry for that. I don't, pretty sure he did die in 1951, but I don't know. I must have his birth year wrong.
While we're discussing this, Rob, I just have a question. If this is too much of a tangent, feel free to ignore it. But I am just curious about this because the entire extended family on both sides that I grew up in, they had this belief, I guess, that because we're not supposed to eat blood, that included like pan juices from meat. And so meat had to be cooked within an inch of its life. When it was like a hockey puck, that's when you could eat it.
Right.
Is there any basis in this? Are there anybody who poskins that way, or was this just Bubba Mises?
So it's an interesting question because anyone who buys kosher meat, which has been soaked and salted and blood removed,
Right.
will notice that there is red liquid oftentimes on the meat that might look a lot like blood, right?
Right.
So I think that's where your family minhag comes from. We can call it a minhag, which is that we want to be sure that any liquid that might look like blood is no longer there. Halachically speaking, once the meat has gone through a koshering process, which we typically think of as being soaked and salted, but it could also be roasted, that whatever liquid is there is not considered dam, is not considered blood. It's considered to be just liquid of the meat, and it's halachically not blood, and there's absolutely no issue with consuming that. So we're touching on a lot of great topics. Another great topic is what is the relationship between halacha and empirical scientific reality, right? If we were to do a chemical analysis of that liquid and find that it has the same exact components and elements as blood does, would we then be forced to call it blood, right? If we make a cup of tea, but do it in, put a tea bag into boiling hot water, and the water changes color and takes on the flavor of what was ever in the tea bag, but it was done in a kli shlishi, in a cup, right, which was twice removed from the cooking source. So have those tea leaves cooked on Shabbos or not, right? So we have a formalistic approach to halacha that says no. Halacha maintains that kli shlishi eino mivashel. If it's twice removed from the original heat source, then it no longer cooks. And so the fact that the water takes on the flavor and the color of the tea is not a cooking process. It's some other chemical or transformative process that's not cooking, and that tea is totally permitted to us on Shabbos. In the same way, right, if it looks like blood but has been already properly soaked and salted, is it blood or not?
I know obviously it's not considered blood, people eat steak, but I just have to ask you, I have two grandmothers from two different countries, right? Two completely different communities, at least 1,000 miles apart, both had the same Bubba Mises. That's why I was confused whether that, just curious whether that was ever a thing or.
It could be if I think it's more, I don't want to say Bubba Mises, but I think it's more kind of the mimetic tradition. This is what people did without necessarily having halachic basis.
Right.
The only halachic basis I could think of to justify it is if a situation where people were koshering meat in their homes and were using a roasting method rather than soaking and salting. So then you really have to roast the meat fully to make sure the blood comes out.
Right.
So there could be some basis for that, but no, it's halachically permitted to enjoy a rare, medium rare steak, and the gravy, and it's delicious, and I do it all the time. Okay, so the next approach to this whole attempt to understand, make sense of Kashrut comes introduced by the Abravanel back in 7, but we'll look at the Ramban, Nachmanides in source number 8, and this is one of my sources where the Hebrew and the English don't line up on the same screenshot, so we'll just look at the English. Ramban says?
Rabbi Kashrut's dates are 1883.
1883. That makes more sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so the Ramban writes, source number 8, the reason for certain birds being forbidden as food is on account of their cruel nature. It is also possible that the reason for certain animals being forbidden is similar, since no animal that chews the cud and has a parted hoof is a beast of prey, while the rest all devour others. There has also been found a difference in nature between animals fit for food and those that which are unfit, as the sages have mentioned, namely that all milks of animals fit for food curdle, whereas all milks of those unfit for food do not coagulate and cannot ever be made into cheese. Thus they are physically different. It is possible to say on the basis of this difference in their natures that those animals unfit for food harm human beings who eat them. This sounds very similar to the Rambam, right? He's trying to base it in science or in empirical reality, but he's beginning to allude to maybe the reason is not necessarily physical, but there's also a spiritual or an ethical component to the prohibition as well, right? That we don't eat animals that are predators because that would somehow instill their cruel nature, their predatory nature into the people that consume it, and we want to be a kind-hearted people, so therefore we do not eat animals that prey on others, right? And so that's borne out by the Sforno as well. In number 9, V'lo titamu bahem nitmetem bam ki ani Hashem Elokeichem v'hitkadashtem. Do not contaminate yourselves in a manner that will make this contamination really serious, right? Sorry. Al titamu bahem ba'ofen shetiu tmeim u'mitum tamim bam. V'zeh yikre ba'achilatam. Do not desecrate or sully yourselves by eating these animals that will make you disgusting and vile, which will happen when you eat them. Ki omnam yoti elokeichem chafatzti shetitkadshu v'tachinu atzmachem el hakedusha. I, God, being your God, desire that you be holy and that you prepare yourselves to be sanctified and not to be vile and disgusting people. And so there's this whole school of thought that says that there's a ethical, some ethical lesson to be learned from the Torah's prohibitions, which plays very much into the most common explanation as well for the prohibition against meat and milk being consumed together, that it would be cruel to cook an animal in its mother's milk, and so that there's supposed to be some ethical components to the laws of kashrus going on as well. Any questions on that?
Is that part of the vegetarian argument?
I don't think so. Just meaning the Ramban doesn't deny that we can eat other animals, right? He's not saying that it's cruel across the board, but it's that we need to only eat animals that will, in their nature, not anyway turn us cruel or turn us give us undesirable traits. Right, we have sources that talk about the pig, that how it's sneaky, and that's why it has one of the simanim of kashrus and not the other. But this approach is not saying that vegetarianism is the answer, because they don't deny that there are many animals that the Torah does permit us. Okay, the final philosophical understanding comes in sources number 12 and 13. And this is the Midrash Rabbah, Breshit Rabbah. Rav Amar, Lo nitnu hamitzvot, elo etzaref bahen et habriot. The mitzvot were given in order to refine humans. L'chi ma echpat le l'kadosh baruch hu, l'misha shochet min hatzavar, u'misha shochet min ha'oref. Does God really care if you kill an animal by running a knife smoothly across its neck over the correct artery, or if you stab it somewhere else and an animal dies, does God really care? No, the Midrash says God doesn't really care. Rather, the mitzvot were given in order to make humans better. So there's two ways of understanding this Midrash. How do you understand this Midrash? What does it mean that the mitzvot were given to make us better, or to refine us? So it could be like the Ramban was saying, that there's some benefit or some clear moral benefits or trait that the Torah is trying to get us to adopt, to absorb by following these rules, right? Or other traits that it's trying to get us to avoid, right? Don't be predatory, don't be cruel, because the Torah doesn't want us to be cruel people. That's one way that this could be understood, that there is some ethical lesson to be derived from each and every mitzvah or prohibition that we were given. The other way is it's more generally that the mitzvah were given not because there's some great meaning or some great lesson to be derived, but rather that it's trying to instill a certain sense of discipline, a certain sense of following the rules, right? The Shulchan Aruch rules that when you put your shoes on in the morning, you're supposed to do it in a very specific way. You have to first put on the right shoe, then the left shoe, then you tie the left shoe, then you tie the right shoe. And so many say, well, why? That's such an odd way to put on your shoes. Why does it really matter? What difference does it make? And many say that it doesn't make a difference in any fundamental sense, but rather it's just instilling in us a sense of discipline, right? God is the commander, and the commander gives us orders, and we have to follow those orders. So too when it comes to our food, God gives us orders, and we have to follow those orders, not because there's any rational or metaphysical explanation for it, other than that we need to train ourselves to follow God's word.
Many people, many non-Jews, really respect Judaism for having order, having
Right.
so many things that we follow, and they respect that very, very highly.
Many do, and many don't. Many mock it, right? That's part of the whole origins of Christianity is, right? Do all these details matter? No, just be a good person. You don't need all the mitzvot, right? So it goes both ways, right? Many people look at the halachic lifestyle. They say, wow, that's really commendable. That's really amazing that this whole group of people is able to follow all these strict rules, and that's something that should be celebrated and should be lauded. And others say this seems to be a little bit crazy, right? All that's really needed out of life is to be a good, decent person and not do harm unto others, and that's all that's needed. So it goes both ways, but it's true. The discipline that is one of the defining characteristics of a halacha community. Oftentimes is seen as one of its greatest qualities. And Rav Hirsch says, he basically says the same thing. You say you do not understand how these forbidden foods can be harmful, even if you were never to understand, even if experience were never to teach you how the divine spirit in man is linked with the body. Would it not be enough for you that God, from whom alone in any case your power of these things derived, has refrained from giving you the right to partake of these foods? You should observe the commandments of the Torah and have regard for its laws because they are at God's behest, not because you think them correct. Even those commandments whose reason you believe you have understood, you should not fulfill because of your understanding, for then you would be listening only to yourself, whereas you should listen to God. Sorry, I didn't scroll down to show that entire quote, source number 13, right? But what we mentioned at the beginning, right? There's a whole camp of Jewish philosophers who says it is wholly inappropriate to think that we can come up with any ta'amei hamitzvot, any explanation or rational approach to understanding the mitzvot that God has given us. We have the mitzvot because God told us to do this. And we can never understand God and what God wants. We can just know, we know what God wants. We can't understand what God wants. And so we do it without asking questions,
Mhm.
without seeking explanation.
As far as order, we just read, Ann and I are reading a book by George Shultz,
Hmm.
who was Secretary of State under Reagan. It's an 800-page book of memoirs. It's a marvelous book. And last night we finished reading a chapter about Japan, and he has great respect for Japan because of their having order with virtually everything,
Hmm.
orderly fashion. That's aesthetics too. It's actually an aesthetic approach to their way of life.
Right.
He was also a Marine and he fought them on the beaches. So, you know, he had both experiences. It's not from just one perspective, but nonetheless, he did respect that aspect.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot to be said to that approach and that way of thinking and understanding it. I'll just conclude by mentioning, you know, I introduced this whole shiur by saying that Parshat Shemini really is divided into two distinct parts. We have the beginning part that describes the dedication of the Mishkan and the tragic death, or the death, I don't know, some tragic or not, but the death of Nadav and Avihu. Then we seem to have a very sharp break, and the second part talks about the laws of Kashrut. There are those who say that there might be a connection between the two, and it goes along the lines of this final midrash and the approach of Rav Hirsch, that the many understand the sin of Nadav and Avihu. Again, whether we can understand and make sense of what happened is a whole other question. But assuming we can, that the problem with what they did was that they offered a foreign fire, Eish Zara, Asher Lo Tziva Otam, that they had not been commanded to offer, and that their sin, you know, elsewhere God says that they were krovai, they were close to me. What they did was truly an act of coming close to God, yet it was unapproved. It was not sanctioned. And so there might be a connection between the death of Nadav and Avihu and the Torah is presenting the laws of Kashrut right after, in that the message of the entire Parshat Shemini is this final message of Rav Hirsch, that we have to only follow God's commands without asking questions, without thinking we can understand. If we think we can understand, if we think we can come to some sort of insight or logic, then we may follow along the same path of Nadav and Avihu. That might be a connection. It might not be. You know, I tend to be, you know, very much identify and relate with the approach that says we need to be able to make sense of these mitzvot. They were given to us as humans, and as humans, we have a need for logic and making sense and being able to understand what's going on, what we're being asked to do. The trouble might come if we think it's only about our perceived understanding or our what we think is the correct understanding, without being able to recognize that there might be other approaches, other ways, or sometimes things that we can't make sense of. And part of being properly religiously observant is to realize our limits and to continue to submit to God's wills, even if we can't make sense of it all the time. So it's a really rich, you know, with any mitzvah, with any topic, we could, you know, get to this same question about is there a rational approach or not? But certainly with Kashrut, it's one that's front and center, and one that we often find ourselves having to explain to others and make sense of for ourselves. And so I hope that this gives us what to think about, some food for thought, if we're going to go along with the puns. And so we will plan on meeting next Tuesday night. We've got a busy week ahead of us. Next Zoom event will be Motzei Shabbos as we bid farewell to Mindy and Mark Dickler. Sunday night is our book discussion. Tuesday night, our Parsha class. Wednesday night, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut. And hopefully we'll have Shabbos davening as well this week. This morning there was rain in the forecast. We'll have to see how that plays out. But anyway, have a wonderful evening, and I'll hopefully see you all a lot in the coming days.
Yasher Koach.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Mr. Koach. Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.